The Manly Warringah Sea Eagles are enduring the worst season since Fonzie jumped the shark in happy days, with terrible on-field results, poor crowds, player infighting, the worst corporate governance probably in the NRL, and one man who is not shedding a river of tears is former North Sydney Bears president Mike Gibbons, who joins us today. Now, Mike, you are not too sad about these developments.
No, they're not shedding tears, not even crocodile ones, Ian. And I think there's a lot of people on the North Shore and the Central Coast who are looking at this too and not shedding any tears. Probably quite pleased, I'd say.
I tell you what, this is the first time that I've heard that horrible word relocation move. Suddenly, there's been a bit of talk in the last couple of years about whether there are too many clubs in Sydney, whether Sydney can sustain the amount of clubs. Manly has always been the Silvertail club. It's always been a very, very powerful and successful club. Now, it's also garnered a lot of enemies in that time. It's probably one of the more unpopular clubs with the Roosters. Do you think relocation is a legitimate option for them?
I think relocation is a legitimate option, but not within Sydney. And I'll tell you why. Because if the NRL is serious about having integrity as a sport and as a code, the first team that needs to be brought back into the team into the competition in terms of relocation has to be the Bears, has to be the Central Coast Bears. And I think Manly, what's happening with Manly is it's basically a case of what goes around comes around from 20 years ago.
Super League it ripped the game apart. There's no question that it ripped the game apart. I was a young player in those days and a lot of my mates were getting the sort of money that you couldn't even believe. And the money that went to both sides made this game divided like you've never seen before. Now, obviously the North Sydney Bears were heavily involved with the ARL in those days. What happened to get them relegated from the competition?
Well, what actually happened was it was post the Super League war when the two foes decided to get together, and then a decision was made, and it was made basically to get rid of two teams. I think by that at one stage in the Super League war we had 22 teams. And so the decision was made to get rid of two teams, and in October 1999 was the date slated to cull two of those teams based on certain parameters. But where the Bears were concerned is that they were told a couple of years before that North Sydney Oval was substandard and you've basically got no choice, you need to relocate to Gosford, and the Bears and the members and the fans decided that's what they would do.
So at that stage, they decided that North Sydney Oval was a substandard ground.
Correct.
So if you look at Brookvale now, which I mean is a dog track, there's no question it's a horrific ground. It needs upgrading. No one's denying that.
Always has been, always will be.
But North Sydney Oval yet hosted what was the centrepiece of the Women's Rugby League, which was the State of Origin. Now that was a tremendous event. You know, they sold out North Sydney Oval.
Yep.
But you're saying that back in the 90s they said that venue was substandard.
Yeah, so you can't have it both ways in the NRL. Either the ground was substandard and the North Sydney Bears had to relocate from their home ground, although the Women's State of Origin was played there, so you wonder how true that was. The flip side is, does the NRL consider women's footy substandard and they'll play it at a substandard ground? So as I say, you can't have it both ways.
So is that I mean, the Central Coast Bears obviously has people are aware of that title or that Bears were looking to relocate. Was that purely because of the ground or were there other issues around that as well?
No, that was the first. The Bears were told you need to move from North Sydney Oval. It's substandard. It's not up to NRL grade, even though you look at Brookvale and you sort of laugh now, but it wasn't funny at the time. So the decision was made and the Bears were promised a regional licence. That meant that when the cull came in October 1999, the Bears were safe, no problems at all. So we would be in the NRL regardless of the cull.
And when the decision was made to go to the Central Coast, was that supported by the board at the time at the North Sydney Bears? Was that...
The board at the time called a meeting of members and of fans and said to those people, you've got two choices. You either relocate to Gosford, North Sydney Oval's not good enough, or the other option is a merger with Manly.
Yeah, right.
And the merger with Manly, I can tell you, I don't think there was one person there that even considered that. To us, that was disgraceful and we would never do it. So that was pretty simple, relocation.
And yet the Northern Eagles stemmed from that decision?
Well, ironically, what the members made very clear to the board at the time, and everybody knew it, there's, Bears forever, Eagles never, that we would never merge with that particular club. As it happens, not long down the track, it was somehow manufactured. That's exactly what happened.
I think when you look at that sort of period of time, you had a couple of mergers. You've got, Wests and Balmain merged. You had St George and Illawarra merged. St George is obviously a powerful club, and as they said at the time, Illawarra got the socks. They're now known as St George Dragons, and Illawarra doesn't really get a mention.
True.
The Northern Eagles went from being a joint venture between Manly and Norths, and at least you got Northern in it, so that was something. But then all of a sudden they split and Manly come back into the competition.
Yeah.
Now, did Manly at that stage have the resources to be able to come back in and stand alone?
Oh, look, I would argue that Manly, in many different ways and shapes over the years, have never had the resources to actually do that. I know they've got a family that's been pumping some money in there, and even though broadcast revenue is coming into the game, if you look at the state of the club now, and if you look at the state of the club 20 years ago, if there was one club likely to be insolvent, it wasn't the Bears, it was Manly, in my opinion.
I think the interesting thing with Manly is that they've always, results-wise, they've always been strong. They've always had, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, they've had a really, really good core of players that have won them premierships. Now, it looks as if the future at Manly, from a playing perspective, is not super bright at the moment. They are fighting it out for the wooden spoon, and they would have to be close to favourites at this point. They've spent a huge amount of money on a marquee player who realistically is on the nose with a lot of people. Where do Manly go from here?
Look, I'll tell you, I think we need to go back a bit as we lead into this. I hear talk about the culture at Manly. My understanding is that back in the 70s, it was Kerry Packer's money that funded Manly. He was a mate of, one of the bigger names at Manly in the day, and they basically bought premierships and they raped and pillaged other clubs to do it. There's a simple reason why Manly are hated, and North Sydney people and Western Suburbs people will tell you at the time, if you remember, that's the reason. And those other clubs were damaged just so Manly could actually buy a premiership. So in terms of culture and why they're hated, that's one of the reasons. But I'll tell you what, the one thing any sporting club needs is you need to have harmony there. You need to have the players getting on very well. If what I'm reading about Manly appears to be true, and there's the issue with Hastings leaving the club and their dust-ups with, the player that you mentioned before, look, that could be the beginning of the end. And if you've got financial troubles on top of that, and a coach who, allegedly is obviously not happy with the whole situation, it's not looking good. But is relocation the answer? As I say, possibly for them, but not in this state, Adelaide or Perth.
Would the Bears be able, there has been obviously, the one thing that's been a constant in rugby league in the last 10 or so years is that the Bears have been in the background. They've been agitating to get back into the competition.
Correct.
It hasn't stopped. There's always been that Central Coast Bears. There was even some talk, am I right, that they would go to the Gold Coast at one stage?
Not so long ago.
Not so long ago. And there has to be a point, at some point, where either the Bears come back or the whole thing dies.
Yeah.
Now, where do you think it's going to go from here?
Look, this is where it should go from here. There is a gap in rugby league, and it astounds me that the NRL can look at this and let it continue, where you have the massive numbers and resources of the Central Coast and the North Shore that were promised a team, and that was going to be the Central Coast Bears. Now, there are a lot of reasons why that didn't happen, and a lot of them nefarious, and a lot of them one day will be exposed. But if the NRL had half a brain, now is the time to bring those people back to rugby league, a lot who have gone to AFL already, to bring them back in straight away. There is no reason not to do it. from a marketing perspective, bringing a 1908 establishment club back into the fold. And let's face it, you're not doing the Bears any great favours because the game's struggling. There's 5,000 or 6,000 people going to games when 25 years ago it was promised, it'll be 20,000 to each game. So it's time to be realistic and look at this and say AFL is forging away. Rugby union are shooting themselves in the foot, but they're still there, and soccer potentially is a burgeoning sport at some stage, but rugby league has got serious issues. Their marketing people should look at this as a massive opportunity, whether they will or not.
Interestingly, you, as we've mentioned, were a former president of the Bears.
Correct.
And deep in your bones, you're a rugby league man.
We grew up there, yeah, we love the
Now,
Bears.
you are now heavily involved with AFL. Your son plays AFL.
Correct.
You're involved with an AFL organisation.
So does my daughter, by the way.
And your daughter, yeah, well, that's good. And so you've got a dyed-in-the-wool rugby league man who has now gone to AFL, which is not an unusual thing.
Sure.
So if the Bears were brought back in, would you come back to rugby league?
Look, it's an interesting point. You say dyed-in-the-wool rugby. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool North Sydney Bears man,
Right.
and potentially Central. It's a big difference.
Yeah.
So what the guys running the NRL need to understand, this was a sport built on passion. This is a sport built on supporting your local club at the local ground. That's what it's all about. I understand business coming into sport and making money and building the profile. I get all that. But I was a North Sydney, as was my family, and family before that were North Sydney Bears people. If you bring the North Sydney Bears back as opposed to AFL, I think there's obviously a lot of people would come back to the game straight away. It would be a huge marketing ploy. It would be a great idea to do that. And there are a lot of people like me who follow another code now because it's a matter of principle. Why would I follow a code that assassinated my own club that I supported since I was a kid? It's like, sorry, we don't work that way.
Well, interestingly, if you look at that, the NRL is always talking about expansion clubs. You know, they're talking about another side in Brisbane, and I'm actually a big supporter of PNG and bringing a side in from there at some point. But the Bears have rusted on supporters. If you look at the Melbourne Storm when they were brought in, they have been probably the most successful rugby league club in the last 10, 15 years. There's no question about that. But they don't have a huge supporter base, you know. If you bring the Bears back, surely you are then bringing in a team that is already going to have sponsorship, it's going to have supporters, it's going to have a good story around it, isn't it?
It's got a PR angle that you could exploit for years. It's absolutely massive. And I'll tell you what, again, Ian, it's a no-brainer. It's an absolute no-brainer. The issue that comes up is that over many years, I've spoken to many journalists, I've spoken to many people involved with the NRL and the New South Wales Rugby League, and the between the lines comment that I'm getting is that the cards are marked for the Bears. I've been told directly the Bears will never be ever coming back. Now, despite all the obvious reasons why they should come back.
Have you been given specifics on why that would be?
I've got some ideas, but we're launching a documentary next year called Laid Bare, which is going to explain and expose everything that's going on about this. So I won't go into too much detail now. Yeah. But all I know is it's been made clear with reactions like, mate, they're never coming back. They're never going to be allowed back in. Now, I want to know why. I've got some ideas, but that sort of thinking has got to be addressed and turned around straight away. And I'm saying it to Todd Greenberg now. Come and address this issue. Come out openly. You guys have got to stop hiding behind the corner and come out now and say, you promised the Central Coast Bears 23 years ago. I'll explain to you why the way they were kicked out was disgraceful and even verging on fraudulent. You need to explain that to everybody that was a disgrace, and you need to make that decision and put them straight back in and do it now.